Today, President Donald Trump is expected to meet with French President Emmanuel Macron. This comes as Trump hardens his stance towards Ukraine. Joining us live this morning to further discuss the very latest on this anticipated trip is none other than political historian and analyst Rich Rubino. Rich, good morning to you. Always a pleasure having you on the show.
Good morning. So glad to be here again.
So first, let's contextualize this trip as it relates to U.S. and French relations. For those that aren't familiar with that stance, how are relations between the U.S. and France? What's the historical significance of this trip?
Yes, well, so certainly the United States and France have been allies for quite some time, but Donald Trump has a different view of the transatlantic alliance. For example, he talks about NATO. Other presidents have said that they are basically unreserved supporters of NATO. Donald Trump has said that if the other countries don't pay the 2% of defense spending that's required, that potentially the United States could egress from NATO. So he has a little bit different position, but that's not only with France, that's respectively with all other countries in Europe. But in terms of France, I think the big issue is really what to do about Ukraine. I think that France fears this, and Britain fears this, and other countries in Europe fear that the United States will support what they believe is a surrender to Russia in terms of the Russian-Ukraine war. That's their essential belief. Some people in Britain, for example, are comparing it to Neville Chamberlain back in 1938. So that's kind of the argument that they're making. You're going to see Donald Trump and Mr. Macron probably negotiating and talking about what potentially could be the final solution, if you will, between Russia and Ukraine. And it's a very different dynamic than I think the United States relationships with other the French relationships with Donald Trump's predecessors.
Yeah, Rich, that actually leads into my next question. We know today marks 3 years since the start of the war between Russia and Ukraine, and we've heard the French president say he's warned President Donald Trump about concerns over Russia's president, Vladimir Putin, against the war. Can you highlight and break down these specific concerns? And then again, do you expect these to be the highlighted discussions between the two gentlemen?
I do think it's going to be the highlighted discussions. They have a little bit of a relationship from Donald Trump's previous term, so we'll see if Mr. Macron can try to work that somewhere to try to get on Donald Trump's positive vantage point, if you will. But yeah, I do think so. I do think that's going to be the main thing. That's going to be the main area of discussion. I think that Donald Trump has a different view of the Ukraine than Joe Biden. Joe Biden was a lot more hawkish on the Ukraine, for example. I think that Donald Trump and his administration have suggested that it's quote unquote unrealistic for Ukraine, for example, to get into NATO. That's something that I think that the French and certainly the British and others would really want to have happen. So it's going to be a very kind of tense discussion about that. Also, Donald Trump, unlike Joe Biden, is willing to meet with the Russians. Joe Biden, once Russia invaded the Ukraine, decided that he was a autocrat, and that he was somebody that the United States could not deal with. So obviously they had to adjust to the new administration in Washington that is more at least sympathetic to there being some sort of a solution between Russia and Ukraine. But I think the I think the French rather are trepidatious that agreement could be something that is more beneficial to Russia than something that would preserve the status of Ukraine.
You mentioned NATO, Rich, and I'm glad you did so, because in recent talks, we know that Ukrainian President Zelensky has mentioned that if a deal can be made with NATO, he'll step down. With your expertise, is that the best thing for Ukraine as they are amid a war with Russia?
I think so. I think that's the casus belli, because the Ukraine, their biggest fear is their security and the potential that they will no longer be a nation. If they're in NATO, then Article 5 of the NATO Charter guarantees that if they are invaded by an outside power, that means that all 32 NATO countries have to come to their defense. So if Russia were to invade the Ukraine, then under the Charter, all 32 countries would come to the defense, which would make it a lot less likely for Russia to invade the Ukraine. The only time Article 5 has been used, by the way, was after the hot September 11th hijackings, when other countries came to defend the United States. Obviously, Russia, part of the reason they invaded Ukraine in the first place is they were trying to stop NATO expansion. It really began in the 90s with Czech Republic, Poland, and Hungary. I think that the Russians view it that there was an agreement between Gorbachev and the first George H.W. Bush administration that essentially the United States would not continue to expand NATO, but they've been expanding into countries that are a little bit too close to comfort for Russia. Russia is kind of using that as a red line, saying Ukraine is the one country, saying Ukraine will not be allowed into NATO and no other countries in Europe will be allowed into NATO either. And that's really, I think, kind of the inflection point, if you will, in this tete-a-tete.
Yeah, Rich, we also know that Zelensky said he wants President Trump to be more than a mediator. For many people, that statement was confusing because, as you know, President Donald Trump does not shy away from his direct opinion, and many people feel he has been very vocal with what he wants to happen from this conflict.
Yes, I think that there are kind of two ways you can do this. One of them is just the United States uses their good offices like they did, for example, to end the war under the Clinton administrations in the Balkans, or they can take a position where they're essentially advocating for one leader over the other. I think many believe that potentially that for example, in the Middle East, that the Trump administration tends to favor between Israel and Palestinians, so they trend to favor Israel, for example. I think that Mr. Zelensky probably fears that in that same vein that the Trump administration is very much administration that tends to favor Russia. And that's not what they want. They would rather have them either be somebody administration like the Biden administration, which is very sympathetic to them, or an administration that favors some sort of a solution, but is simply using the good offices, using the offices of the United States to try to negotiate a settlement. He does not want the United States to be there as a advocate of the Russian side.
Rich, looking ahead this week, we know that President Donald Trump will be meeting with the UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer. Discuss the importance of this trip. Are you expecting those same talks as it relates to international conflicts? We have seen the UK very vocal as it relates to the conflict in the Middle East, as it relates to Israel and Hamas. Are you also thinking they might highlight that topic?
Yes, I do. This is the flagship issue of pretty much the transatlantic alliance. He's meeting with both nuclear powers in Europe. First it was France, and then it's going to be Great Britain. I think that he has a little bit more adversarial relationship sometimes with the British Prime Minister. I think it's going to be very interesting to see how they negotiate, to see when if they have a press conference where they talk about both of their sides. But England, just like France, is very much sympathetic to the Ukraine, and I think they're going to say that there should not be any sort of a surrender, that any sort of an agreement is something that's going to benefit the Ukraine. They're also probably going to make unreserved advocacy of the Ukraine joining NATO, which is something that I think is almost a non-starter for the Trump administration. So it'll be very interesting to see. Obviously, Trump has a different tact on foreign policy, America First foreign policy, which is different than his predecessor, Joe Biden. I think that Joe Biden would have been was obviously very sympathetic to the Ukraine, but I think that it's going to be interesting as the British Prime Minister, as well as the British Prime Minister and the French President, try to get Donald Trump to be more sympathetic to the Ukrainian side, and that's probably going to take up the bulk of their conversations.
Political analyst and historian Rich Rubino, always a pleasure. Thank you so much for your dialogue and perspective, Rich. I hope you have a great rest of your Monday.
Thank you so much for having me on again.
Thank you.